This morning, I think my intention is to try to complete chapter 7. Originally, I thought I was going to split it up, but the material just wouldn't work. The remainder of chapter 7 deals with the suffering of Jesus, but specifically it deals with his trial that he had and up to the point of the crucifixion. So when we look at the trial of Jesus, we probably spend weeks just discussing all the intricate details of it. But this morning, I think what I'd like to do is just get a good scope of the view of what he went through and how the trial progressed, and see how that affects, or at least how that applies to the prophecies that we find in Isaiah and also in Psalms. So with that said, we'll be finishing out the chapter, and that will probably give us one extra class period in which we will have nothing to do, and I may have to call on Mark to finish that one up, because I believe we're going to be in College Station last week. By getting that one Sunday free, or at least one Sunday free, that will allow me to do what I need to do there. So anyway, what we'll be looking at this morning in chapter 7 is the sufferings that Christ went through during his trial. We'll be looking at the suffering of the Messiah, Isaiah 53, his scourging. Before I go any further, due to circumstances this past week, James kept me hopping pretty good with the add-on to the house, and the trip that I made to Houston yesterday, I did a lot of plagiarism on my notes in this class. So a lot of this material is not my own, and you won't find my rabbit trails in it, but there's going to be a lot of material that we'll be covering. So we're looking at the suffering of the Messiah, his scourging, his rejection by men, his humiliation and his abuse, his arrest and initial examination, his trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, the abuse before the hearing, the formal mourning condemnation, his trial before Pilate, Pilate's examination of Jesus, hearing before Herod, Pilate attempts to release Jesus, the final mockery and scourging, the final verdict, and the fact that he was hated without cause and its application to his followers. So you look at that and you say, how are you going to squeeze all that in 30 minutes? Well, I don't know, but I want to try. Sometimes, we can look at situations like this, and as we go over weeks and weeks of studying it, sometimes we miss the overall picture. And I think sometimes, a good, quick overall picture helps us understand the intricacies of the event as we go into further detail and study down the road. So that's what we're going to do this morning, is the 10,000-foot view of this. The vicarious sufferings of the Messiah, that is, sufferings that he suffered for others, that he bore for our sins. Isaiah 53:5 says, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed." We have read this so many times that we're familiar with what it says and its application. But the prophetic statement foretells that the Messiah would suffer, not for himself, but he would suffer for others, and that's exactly what happened. He was pierced for our transgressions, and this refers to the bodily injury that he suffered, not only through the beatings, but we know that his hands and his feet were pierced, and also we know that his side was pierced by the spear of the Roman soldier during his crucifixion. He also says he was crushed for our iniquities. Now this indicates that he was going to have severe suffering and a crushing affliction. And both of this includes the physical torment and also the mental anguish that he was going through. And anybody could say he did not have mental anguish. I tell you right now, he had to have mental anguish to suffer, to endure what he endured. Chastising was for our well-being, fell upon him. The punishment necessary to bring about peace and reconciliation of man before God, he bore that, and it fell upon him. Through his chastening, we have well-being through him. And by his scourging, we are healed. By his stripes, we are healed. Salvation and spiritual healing came by his suffering. Now, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, this is commentators that actually it's a pretty good little commentary. Sometimes it's a little, it's not very thorough, but some of the times they throw out some good ideas that are worth noting. But they make these same observations in this particular passage. When they say wounded literally refers to a bodily wound, specifically pierced. Bruised suggests crushing pressure and intense suffering inwardly and outwardly. Stripes, a prophetic statement about his scourging for his crucifixion. So the meaning of this passage that we find in Isaiah 53 and verse 5 indicates to us that the suffering was vicarious, that is, in place of others. That the Messiah had no sin of his own. He bore the punishment that was deserved by humanity. And by his suffering, it accomplishes the spiritual healing and reconciliation between man and God, that we through him, through his shed blood, will have remission of our sins, that he acts as a mediator and the high priest between us and between God. So this particular passage is very important to us because it shows us what he endured for humanity. Now, the scourging of Jesus. We know that Pilate's order in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 26 records that Pilate had Jesus scourged before delivering him to be crucified. Possible intention of Pilate was that he hoped that the severity of the punishment would satisfy the crowd and that they would be content and would release Jesus and he wouldn't have his blood upon his hands. Pilate really didn't want to, I think, have to deal with this, and because he understood that from a Roman standpoint, Jesus was not guilty of the sins or the crimes that they were committing against him. And as we said in our last class, and we'll say again this morning, it was under political pressure that Pilate finally gave in and submitted Jesus to the will of the Jews. The instrument used was a scourge, and we've talked about this before. It's multiple leather thongs tipped with metal or bone fragments, and generally the method of punishment was that the prisoner was stripped of his clothing, he was bound to a low post, and body bent forward to stretch the skin, and the whipping began. Area of the punishment, the back, buttocks, and the legs. So there was no part of his back that was not receive this beating. The effects, we know through the beating, torn flesh, by the blows, blood loss, severe trauma, and even some victims died during the scourging itself. So this was not simply just a routine beating like the Jews would give, but this was a severe form of punishment. Now, comparing the Jewish punishment, and we said before that the Roman soldiers were not bound by the restriction of the Jewish punishment. We'll see that in just a moment. The Jewish laws required no more than 40 stripes. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Paul says the stripes were generally 40 minus 1, which was 39, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, this limit was intended to avoid killing the victim. I guess God figured that a person could endure 40 stripes. But nonetheless, I don't think I could endure no more than 1 or 2. Roman soldiers were not bound by this restriction. As we said, they whipped the guy until the commander said enough is enough. So when it comes to Jesus being whipped by the Roman soldiers under the command of their commander, we don't really know how many he received. It could have been less than 40, or it could have been quite a bit more than 40. Now, the pulpit commentary notes that Christ was willingly endured his suffering. In Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6, it says the Messiah gave his back. It wasn't taken, it was given to those who struck him. So that's the important thing they have to remember. Jesus' arrest, his his punishment, or at least his what he had to endure, the trials, all of this was because Jesus gave himself to them, and they had no control over having taken it. They may have thought they took it from him, but in reality, Jesus gave it to them. Rejected by men. He is despised and rejected of men, says Isaiah 53 and verse 3. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. So the description of the despised Messiah that Isaiah gives here is that he was despised, he was forsaken of men, a man of sorrows, he was acquainted with grief, rejected and unesteemed. And the rejection was by the Jewish nation. In fact, one thing that our author pointed out, and I really didn't catch it until he pointed it out to me, he says, we did not esteem him. So it's the rejection of the Jewish people. And what he was saying is that the rejection of the Jewish people was not only the people themselves, but he was including himself as a Jew. We are the ones that have rejected him. Not someone other than the nation of the Jews, but it was interesting that the promise through Abraham and God's care through the years to ensure that the Messiah would come through the lineage, the Jewish people finally rejects God and the Messiah. So he identifies the nation of the Jews. So the fulfillment that we see of this in the New Testament, we see in John chapter 19, the Jewish leaders cry, "We have no king but Caesar." That's a rejection of the Messiah. John 1 and verse 11, Jesus came to his own people, yet they did not receive him. He was rejected by his own countrymen. John chapter 7 and verse 5, even his brothers did not initially believe in him. That's kind of hard, I guess, to bear, is that your own brothers in your own family did not believe who you were. John chapter 7 verses 47 through 49, the Pharisees even mocked those who believed in him. So those that were believers in Christ, they even ridiculed not only the Christ, but also his followers. And then Matthew chapter 21 verses 2, 41 through 43, we see the prophecy that they would reject the cornerstone of the gospel, that is the Messiah. So we see the fulfillment in the New Testament that Isaiah had spoke of so many years before. His humiliation and abuse, Isaiah 15 verse 6. I gave my back to the smiters and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. So this shows us that Jesus had control over the situation. He freely gave his back, his cheeks, and his face to the abuse and the humiliation that he was going to follow. So the prophetic description of this, his back was given, beard was plucked out, face not hidden from shame, and he endured the spitting and humiliation. So what is the meaning of all of this? That the Messiah willingly accepts the suffering. He endures the shame and the abuse, and these represents the most degrading insults in the Eastern culture. Even today, if someone spits in your presence, that's bad, but to spit on you is even worse. And if you spit in your face, that's probably the ultimate that you can have to endure. Even today, we wouldn't, that's an insult to us as it is. Now, the commentary from Hegstenberg, this is the Christology of the Old Testament. He pretty much says the same thing. Plucking the beard, extreme humiliation, spitting, grave insult, prophecy described. So what it amounts to is that they are all in agreement to what this endures, to what the Savior had to endure for our salvation of mankind. So we begin to see the fulfillment in Matthew chapter 26, verses 67 through 68. They did spit in his face, they buffeted him, and they smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is he that smote you?" So we see now that the fulfillment of this prophecy is being fulfilled by what they did to Christ. They spit in his face, they buffeted him, they smote him, and they even mocked him. It even records that Jesus, that's what we just looked at. So Luke chapter 18, verses 31 through 32, Luke records, and then he took to him the 12 and said, this is prophesying to them what was going to happen in the next, in a very short time. He took to him the 12 and said to them, behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and all things that were written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man shall be accomplished. So this is a very good indication to us that all things that were written by the prophets were going to be accomplished. So there's nothing left that the prophets have prophesied is going to come true. So if you see these people now standing up hollering that since Iran and all the Arab nations are in this big Gulf War, we're fixing to see Armageddon and all this other stuff, they say this is fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. No, it's not. Because the prophecies of the Old Testament were fulfilled in Christ. The only one left is his promise to return at the end of time. So anyway, he says all of these things were accomplished, for he shall be delivered to the Gentiles and shall be mocked and spitefully entreated and spitted on. So Jesus knew what was going to happen. He told them that go back to the prophets and look, what you're about to see happen has been foretold of me. So Jesus' prediction records this for our benefit. He was going to be handed to the Gentiles, that is the Romans. He was going to be mocked, mistreated, and spat upon. So he predicted this was going to happen to him even before he knew, or at least the world knew what was going to happen. So the prophets foretold of it. Jesus said this is fixing to happen, and then indeed it did happen. So there's no problem understanding what Jesus was fixing to endure. He knew what was coming. So now we come to the arrest and the initial trial. This was the prophecies of what was going to happen. Now we begin to see it happening in these trials from the Jewish Sanhedrin and from the Roman courts. So first, Jesus was taken to Annas. Now, a little bit of just a quick background on Annas. He was the former high priest at the time. And he was removed by the Romans. He was replaced by his son-in-law Caiaphas. And even though he was not the high priest, he still contained, or at least was able to maintain a lot of influence among the Jews. It's kind of like even today, you may have a president that may step down, another one stands in his place, but a lot of people will say this guy's got a lot of influence, if he just would make things public. So Caiaphas was an important person. He had a great deal of power, a lot of authority, and he could control things the way he wanted it to go. And with Annas being his son-in-law, it's kind of like, okay, I married your daughter, I guess I need to do what you say. So it's kind of that situation. I think Annas may have been controlled by Caiaphas to a certain extent about what to do and what not to do. Still had a great amount of influence among the Jews. Now, possible reasons why Jesus was taken to Annas first. Since Annas was the high priest at the time, he was the legitimate, person that needed to see these events, or at least make a ruling on these particular events. It was to gain the approval. The people looked to the high priest for guidance, and so now Annas is the one that's going to have to initially deal with the situation of Jesus. And then this was also done to try to begin the evidence gaining, or at least the evidence gathering process against Jesus so that they could take him into the Roman trials. And during the course of this, an incident occurred where one of the temple officers struck Jesus, insulting him with a slap. So now we begin to see the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And now we begin to see the Sanhedrin begin its course of taking Jesus into trial. Annas was the first one that they gathered. But we'll see towards the end, Caiaphas was the one that pretty much controlled what was going on. Now the trial before Caiaphas, so this was sometime Thursday night before the Sanhedrin. So it was an informal night hearing. And first of all, this was an illegal process because all the trials should have been conducted during daylight hours, but not this one. It was an illegal court session, and it was done at night to gather as much information as they could before the start of the next day. So it was more like a preliminary meeting to gather all the accusations and get all the information together in front of the priest and the Sanhedrin to be used against Jesus. Now, there were a lot of attempts to try to get the evidence before Christ. You know, they said they brought in false witnesses, and then eventually they found two, because the law of Moses said you had to have at least two or three witnesses to be able to convict someone of a crime. So it's kind of like, just bring these people in until we find two people that says the same thing, and then we have our witnesses. So it was not really legitimate in that respect. I think if a judge stood in a court today and the lawyer said, I'm going to start bringing in witnesses until we find two or three that say the same thing, it's got to be right. I think the judge would throw it out, because that is not true evidence gathering. And during this process, Caiaphas attempted to get Jesus to defend himself in these accusations. And as we said before, Jesus did not do that, because by defending himself, he would fall into the trap of what they're trying to set. And in fact, these accusations meant nothing to Jesus, because his job, or at least his purpose here on earth, was to die for the salvation of man and ensure that man find themselves in the right position with God. These accusations meant nothing. But when the Jews began to ask him, or when Caiaphas asked him, you know, are you the Christ, the Son of God? At that point, that's what mattered. And they needed to understand the severity of what their actions were all about. These accusations meant nothing to him. They were just, in his eyes, they were folly compared to what they were doing to themselves before the sight of God. Now, Jesus' confession, we know that he acknowledged the truth of his identity when they asked him, tell us, are you the Son of God, are you the Messiah? And he said, he declared to them that they would see him one day sitting on the right hand of power, which is an indication that he'd be standing by or sitting by the Father himself in heaven. And that when the day of judgment came, he would be coming in the clouds of heaven. So the reaction of Caiaphas was that he dramatically tore his clothes and he screamed out, you know, blasphemy, what more do we need to hear from this deceiver? He's already convicted himself, which, again, you cannot convict yourself in a Jewish court. It has to be by the witnesses. So Caiaphas put on this big show and accused Jesus of blasphemy, and declared that because of that, he was worthy of death. The law of Moses said blasphemy was worthy of death by stoning, and then the witness would have to be the one to throw the first stone. So Caiaphas got half of the law of Moses right concerning blasphemy, even though Jesus did not commit blasphemy, but the punishment of the crime did not fit the Jewish law. So here we go. You know, what you going to do, Caiaphas? You know, in this particular situation, you can't carry through your the law of Moses requirement. So he rent his clothes and said, what further need do we have of witnesses? Mark chapter 14. So the council at this particular point, Thursday night, declared that Jesus was worthy of death. Problem was, and we've said this before, because they were under the Roman rule and authority, they could not put Jesus to death. It had to be done by the Romans' approval. And whatever the Romans said, that's the way the man would die. Even if they said he had to be stoned, then the Romans, they said, no, we're going to do it a different way. That's the way it was going to happen. So they declared that Jesus was worthy of death, and now it becomes a problem with Roman Roman rulers. They've gathered the evidence that Jesus was a blasphemer, that he was, I guess, an insurrectionist among the people, and that he was going to, according to the Jewish laws, at least in their eyes, he needed to be dealt with harshly. And then we got to take it to the Romans. So after the hearing, or after this decision by the council, we see Jesus was spat upon, he was struck and mocked, he was blindfolded and taunted, and all of this occurred Thursday night. So now we come to the formal morning condemnation. They gathered the evidence, now we got to get the formal condemnation in a true court and Sanhedrin in the course of a day, when it's daylight hours. They had to get that in to make sure that it fit, even though they had all the evidence gathered beforehand. And as I said before, they even had predetermined that Jesus was going to die, and they just had to find some way to do it. Now, requirement of Jewish law had to be during the daylight. The purpose of the morning meeting was to make the earlier decisions that they had made Thursday night to appear legal before the people, or at least before the Romans, the people and the Romans, and so that they could officially announce the verdict of death in a court that seemed to be legal in all aspects. But we saw, or we talked about just a moment ago, the limitation of their authority. They could condemn someone, but they could not execute someone. So that was a requirement of the Roman people, the Roman rulers. You have to get our approval. Now, the Jews think they've got everything in order, and they've got all their evidence. Now they have to bring it before Pilate to make sure that the Romans are good with what their decision was. So they said the location was a praetorium, the official residence of the Roman governor. Evidently, they've now moved into the Roman area of authority. Their initial plan was hopefully that Pilate would just take their request and simply accept it and do away with Jesus. You know, it's just kind of like, okay, Pilate doesn't really want to deal with us. He has the authority over us, but the least that he has to do with us, the better off he is. So they're kind of thinking that if we agree on it, Pilate will agree with us and not make any problems, carry right on through with it. But that was not to happen. That was not happening. When Pilate listened to the accusations and talked to Jesus, he still found no evidence for punishment of death. So new political charges were now, they're coming up with new things that they could throw at Pilate to try to encourage him to accept their verdict of the punishment. New accusations were that that this man was misleading the nation away from the Jewish rulership. And because of that, this man is now going to have insurrection problems with Jesus and his followers. That's going to be a problem with the Roman Empire. He was also saying that it was forbidden to pay taxes. Okay, you got thousands of people that refuse to pay taxes to Rome. That's going to be your problem, Pilate. But more importantly, he was claiming to be a king. And that is definitely going to be a problem with Caesar. So Pilate, you need to judge this man worthy of death, not simply because we think he's a blasphemer, but now we've thrown these extra charges in saying that he's a threat to the Roman Empire. So you kind of see how they move from one thing into another. Since Pilate didn't accept his first, the first accusations that they agreed on in the Sanhedrin, now they're struggling to find something that would get Pilate's attention and get him to deal harshly with Jesus. So the analysis of the trial so far at this point is that the first charge was vague. Second charge was false. And then the third charge was just distorted truth. We had false witnesses. We had the accusation of blasphemy, which was false. And then we had distorted truth that now the Jews were trying to get to Pilate. So the analysis of this trial just does not fit something that would be legally binding even today. So Pilate's examination of Jesus. First question, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus' response, he acknowledged his kingship but clarified the nature of his kingdom. My kingdom is not of this world. Okay, well, you're not a threat to Caesar. Jesus answered, and this was in John chapter 18 and verse 36, that his kingdom, as he presented it to Pilate, was not political, of an earthly nature. We can't get this through our premillennialist heads today, but that's what Jesus said. It's not political and it's not earthly. It was purely spiritual in nature. So with that understanding, this is not a problem to Pilate and it's not a problem to the Roman government. And then statement, what is truth? You know, it's kind of like, you know, Pilate just doesn't understand what the truth is of either this, the truth of what the Jews thrown to him, what versus what Jesus says. You know, he's kind of juggling all of this in his mind, and he just says, what is truth? You know, so he repeatedly declares that he finds no fault in him, and he's not worthy of death. So now they bring it into Herod's court. Because Jesus was from Galilee, Pilate said, I'm going to get this off my plate, and I'm going to throw it on Herod's plate. So Herod was kind of curious. He wanted to see Jesus perform a miracle, but Jesus was silent before Herod. So anyway, Herod turns him back over to Pilate. Before they do him, they dress him in a robe, they mock him, they put threat on him. You know, he goes through some more abuse there. And as a result, he returns Jesus back to Pilate. Pilate attempts to release Jesus. You know, he doesn't really see this man worthy of death, but he was going to ensure that he was trying to do what he could to get the man released. During the Passover custom, they had the ability to release a prisoner during the feast. And so this was brought up to the people. Who do you want to be released? Do you want Jesus, or do you want the worst murderer that we've got in prison, which is Barabbas? And they started screaming and hollering Barabbas. And there's some conjecture that since there were 3 crosses ready for execution, that the one that was reserved, the one that Jesus died on, was the one that was reserved for Barabbas. And I think this was the reason why the other 2 initially were angry at Jesus, because they may have thought that, you know, we should have been one and you had something to do with it. Because of that, we're going to die, and this wicked man is going to be released. We're just common thieves. But anyway, the reason Barabbas was released is because the Jewish leaders manipulated the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas. And how they did that, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure what kind of crowd was out there. But be that as it may, they were evidently influenced by the Jewish leaders and easily persuaded. So the final mockery and the scourging, Pilate orders a scourging. This was to satisfy the crowd. I think, too, now that Barabbas has been released, he's thinking, well, if I beat this man publicly, they will see that he's been punished enough, and maybe they'll just tell me to release him. Place a crown of thorns on his head, purple robe, and the soldiers struck and ridiculed him. So Pilate presents Jesus, behold the man. He hoped that the sight that was of Jesus after what he'd been through would produce enough sympathy that the crowd would release him, but instead they said crucify him. They wanted to go all the way to his death. So the final verdict. Was a new religious accusation. The Jewish leaders declared he had made himself the Son of God. Pilate's fear was that because of this, Pilate becomes more afraid. His threat was that the leaders warned Pilate that he would be accused of opposing Caesar. So we had to see a religious accusation. We see Pilate's fear of the people, and we see the political threat that now all of this was beginning to show up. So it's kind of like, I don't care about the religious accusations, but the political aspect of this I have to deal with, and I don't want Caesar to come knocking on my door demanding my head because I didn't do what was necessary to calm the crowds down. So Pilate's symbolic act was he washed his hand, declaring himself innocent. And the crowds were just as happy with that. They said, let his blood be upon us and upon our children. We will be responsible for the death of this man. So the final decision, Barabbas was released, and Jesus was delivered for crucifixion, and this was about 6 o'clock in the morning. So hated without a cause. David says, they hate me without a cause, being my enemies wrongfully. Now, the commentary of Spurgeon says that Jesus harmed no one, he helped and blessed many, yet enemies surrounded him. And Jesus quotes this psalm to make an application to himself, meaning that the hatred that was towards Jesus fulfilled the scriptures that were spoken of so many years before. The application to to Christ's followers is simply that the world hated me, they will hate you. And we have seen that through so many years of Christianity on earth. Now, many rejected Christ this time because of ignorance, because of malice, because of neglect. So the rejection is not through knowledge or witnessing or understanding. It's because they just do not want to have anything to do with God. So the warnings of the disciples, they persecuted me, they will also persecute you, John chapter 15 and 20. And we as Christ should expect opposition and possibly persecution in this world today. So conclusion, Christ suffered for our sins. His wounds brought about our healing. He was rejected by his own people, fulfilling the prophets. He endured shame and cruelty willingly and gave his back to the smiters. He was condemned, though innocent, and hated without cause. Through his suffering came salvation, and this was the purpose of the cross. Who would be willing to suffer and die just to fulfill prophecy? You know, a lot of people say that, you know, you can go to the Old Testament and find a prophecy and say, I fulfill it. But here is prophecies concerning what was going to happen to the Messiah. Would a false prophet be willing to say, I'm going to fulfill the punishment that he went through? You're not going to find it, not willingly find it. And I think that is a very strong proof that the prophecies applied to Jesus, because everything that he went through was foretold and he endured it. So, questions or comments?
I think today the Jews are, even today, suffering for all that. 70 AD, they were scattered all over the world. Like you say, you can't trace their lineage anywhere. And to this day, they're being persecuted. Israel today is surrounded by enemies constantly. You know, I don't think we'll ever be in peace with them to this day.
It's kind of like what God said about Ishmael. He said, he'll be your brother, you'll live over next to him, and he'll be a wild man, and no one will be able to obtain him.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I see something like these crazy Gulf wars break out, one back, about 10, 15 years ago, I guess, and now this one, it's, they're wild people, and you're not going to be able to tame them, and they're just...
They hate Jews, you know, just to this day.
They hate everybody.
I know.
I say that in general. Let me just back up and say, the people that rule the country and those that are hardline Muslims generally hate everybody that's not Muslim. Now, there are those that are pacifists, those that look at the Quran and only see the good things that Muhammad might have said, and they're peaceful. We have peaceful Muslims living here today. But we have to understand too that a lot of times what we see on the news is because of those people that are in power, that want to maintain their power because they love the wealth and the control and the honor that they get from it, and they put up on a pedestal and worship. That's what they want, and they don't want anybody to take it from them. Just like the Jewish leaders of Annas and Caiaphas. I think Caiaphas was the biggest instigator of the trial of Jesus, and I think he wanted to make sure that his authority and that his control and power still remained, even though he was not the high priest any longer. And that's kind of interesting too, because he was the high priest, and when the Romans removed him and placed a son-in-law in his stead, the law of Moses said that's not how it works. Once you're a high priest, you're a high priest for the entirety of your life. It ends when you die, not when someone says you're no longer the high priest. Anyway, I appreciate y'all's attention, and hopefully that we got through that. We'll begin chapter 8 on page 98 on Wednesday night. Hopefully this quick run through was beneficial. I know we could learn a lot of things just by minutely analyzing it, but that was not the case this morning.